prepared for multiple outcomes. Because if you're not, you're going to get caught flat-footed, as we've said many, many times before.
Right.
And that goes on the fiscal management side as well. The last thing that you want to be in is too heavily reliant upon what may happen in the future. Just having been involved in government for so many years, I understand that anytime there is a budget proposal, something that's going to affect the budget, it requires both sides to come to some type of an agreement in order for the money to ultimately be allocated to the program. The program that you're referring to was the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and when the program details first came out, I thought that it was a tremendous idea. I thought that it had taken into consideration all of the ideas that I had thought to myself, that the payroll protection program was a wonderful government initiative, but it didn't do enough to address the lost earnings of the owners. So it was great, you can keep your staff on, and that's wonderful. You want to make sure that they're all paid, but it wasn't taken into consideration that you're going to work for free during this pandemic, and you're just trying to keep your doors open. There were a lot of other restaurateurs that just didn't make it. They couldn't even get through because there just was not enough income there, or they were too far behind. This program was designed to take your 2019 gross income minus your 2020 gross income, and whatever that difference was minus PPP loans, that was going to be a grant that they were going to extend, and it was designed specifically for the restaurant industry. We had our fingers crossed that monies would become available. There was an enormous amount of preparation of documentation that needed to be culled together in order to be able to demonstrate what your loss was. So obviously your tax returns, and it's not uncommon, particularly with corporate returns, that many corporations go on extension. So they may not be ready to file on March 15th. That's when the corporate filing date is March 15th. And a lot of people, their accountants aren't ready, they haven't done all their year end. And so we had to make sure our return was ready for March 15th, our 2020 return. We had to make sure we had other documentation in place. And there was a lot of anticipation leading up to that day. And ultimately we did make application. Unfortunately, the program it was initially rolled out that certain classes of owners were going to receive first priority. There was a lawsuit drafted, and it was filed, I believe, in the appeal circuit in Texas and in Alabama. And ultimately, those federal judges said that the way the program was designed was unconstitutional because it allowed for preferential treatment to certain classes, and they said that they couldn't do it that way. They couldn't administer a program that way. So although we were approved, we were never funded. So it was something that was not that we were extraordinarily disappointed, but you don't sit there and rely upon that to be your be-all end-all. You have to figure out another way to keep the wheels of operation going forward.
Exactly. Now, what elements do you think are necessary for a restaurant, any restaurant, to survive this kind of unprecedented storm?
I think we've said it before, it requires, obviously, everything starts from the top, and how you handle yourself on a day in and day out basis, and the message that you're trying to deliver to your team is that keep plugging away, keep doing the cornerstones of our business, making sure that people are leaving happy, that we're putting out a great product. Those are all the things that have to happen, whether it's a pandemic or not. When you're in a circumstance like this, every customer becomes that much more important. And I recall very early on, we had a situation one evening where a person had ordered takeout and for delivery, and there was a question in the order, and they were trying to get in touch with the customer to address the question that they had. As a result, they never started the rest of the order. So the person didn't get their food for about an hour and a half because they didn't get a chance to call back in a timely fashion. The customer just was not happy. And I remember that evening explaining to my team that you have to understand, these are people that are sitting home all day. They're right, if you recall in the beginning, everyone was sitting home. They're agitated. They don't know the fear of the unknown. And now they get to the point where they're ready to have dinner with their family, and dinner's an hour and a half late. Those type of mistakes become that much more accentuated when you're in a situation like this. You never want mistakes ever to happen, but when they happen during a period of time like this, it just seems that much more of an issue for me. That was the concern that I had, that we had to limit our mistakes as much as possible.
How do you do that?
You have to just pay that much more attention to detail. And it requires an enormous effort on everyone that's here. It's not just me. It would be poor of me to say that. It requires everyone to buy in and understand that there will be another day. If you look a year later, look what a difference things are in terms of where we are from an operations perspective. And I like to think that the groundwork that we exhibited during the pandemic is now paying dividends. I like to believe that there is a payback on how we handled ourselves during that period of time. But we did a lot of different hokey things. We were delivering a lot to a lot of new families that had moved into the area, and we were delivering cookies to them with little notes saying compliments of Trattoria 632, welcome to the neighborhood, particularly if they were a new customer. We wanted to make sure that they understood that we are a family-oriented business, and we recognize when someone new is here, right? We wanted them to appreciate that that we appreciated the fact that they were ordering from us, and that they were going to be part of our growing family, and that was the intention.
Exactly, and I remember a conversation we had way back when we were talking about the impact of mistakes during this kind of time, and you said that it kind of took you back to the time when you were with your partners.
Yes.
And the way in which the restaurant was being run, you felt was disastrous, and part of my recollection of that is that there were many, many mistakes being made.
Yes. Just when you go from when that period of time when with my former partners, there was just tons of mistakes constantly, and I remember one time particularly, and I brought it up in a meeting years ago. There was just no attention to detail, and there was a server who had walked by. He had dropped a fork. Another server was coming behind him. The other server had gone into the kitchen, and the other one just walked right past it. And I made sure that I brought that up at the meeting to sit there and say, there's too much complacency going on. People you didn't even think to pick that up that day, and it sent a message to me that you guys maybe are missing the ball here, and you're not understanding that it's that type of lack of attention and complacency that is a ripple effect into so many other facets of our business, that maybe not paying attention to a table, not having any bread on the table or water, or that they've been sitting there with their dishes ready to be cleaned for an extra 5 minutes. It's that type of unfortunate things that tend to metastasize when people are not paying attention.
Right.
And I felt, for whatever reason, during the pandemic, if there was a mistake, it seemed to bring me back to that period of time, because what was my thought process? My thought process was, when all those mistakes were being made years ago, when I had my the old team, and there was a dramatic shift in the number of customers that were coming in. So now, fast forward, you're in the pandemic, and if I see a mistake and I have no barometer to check my numbers against, I immediately go to the dark side of the moon, and I'm sitting there saying, this is a disaster, and we're never coming out of this. So you start to play tricks on yourself, and you make yourself believe that everything is that much worse, but you also don't want to reflect that to the rest of your team, because then they start to lose confidence.
Exactly. And is it also possible that during the pandemic time, or for a period of time when things did slow down somewhat? I mean, I observe your team in action fairly often when I'm at the restaurant, and everyone is operating at top speed. And most especially
Yes.
Anthony, I can't believe you're not actually on roller skates,
Yes.
because he's, you blink and he's gone. But might it have been a little bit of a letdown after the frantic pace that they were used to?
I definitely believe that there is some of that I just think it's just complacency. Things have slowed down, and we often say that here, there'll be nights where you can't even imagine how many people we're serving, and there's not a single mistake all night. And then you'll have a night where it's an off night where maybe you only do 10 tables, and on that night, there'll be mistakes. And you sit there and you say, how is it possible? And I think it's because, much to what you've just addressed, is there is a letdown period, and I guess your awareness is not as heightened. And so during that period of time, the days were long and slow. So people maybe stopped paying attention to detail. So you had mistakes, and in my eyes, thinking back to that time, they probably weren't even that terrible, but I felt they were much worse, I think, because of the circumstances. I think that was a mitigating factor for me, is that I probably allowed myself to become overly stressed on something that probably was not as big of an issue, but because I felt of that fear of maybe perhaps losing people, we were in no position to lose anybody at that time.
Exactly, which is understandable. You and I spoke at one point about the possibility of fundraising.
Correct.
When things were looking particularly bleak.
Yes.
And I just thought to myself, wow, there's so many people for whom this restaurant is, an institution for them. And I thought, oh, I bet everyone would rally around and
Yeah.
want to make sure that you stayed in business. But I sensed that was just not where you were leading.
No, and if I mentioned it last week, I'll mention it again. The last thing you ever want anyone to ever have a perception of, at least in my eyes, is a perception of weakness and frailty. I don't think it's ever a good sign in any business. And the last thing you want people to think is that you are trying to maybe impart your problems onto them. I've lived through too many of those issues. So I was not a fan of it, and I think I raised it to you last time. There was a restaurant, I won't give the name, but it was out at Stanford, and they have some other locations, where when they allowed for restaurants to reopen for table service, this individual was going to be charging a COVID fee of $25 a person, and the negative backlash that he received on social media for proposing this fee, and you would thought that he would have realized what the adverse effect of this message was. He just wasn't reading the room, and he was actually challenging those who were throwing, shade at him for requesting this COVID fee. And he was like, well, I have a family to feed, and it just played so poorly And I remember we had spoken about the fundraising aspect, and I said that is exactly the reason why I wouldn't want to do fundraising, because I just don't think that it's appropriate, or it's not a good look for someone to be asking for help. I just thought it sent the wrong message, particularly during that period of time. And I saw the negative reaction that he received as a result of, essentially, the way he tried to color it was, we've been down for so long, all I'm asking for is my loyal customer base to consider it, and you know, I have to feed my family. And they just wanted no part of it, these people, and they really went after him on social media. Yeah.
Interestingly, despite the destructive impacts of the pandemic, and there can be no doubt that it was incredibly, it was huge, you still stayed true to your approaches and philosophies that we now know are the hallmark of this restaurant. And you really, you never wavered. How were you able to do that?
Well, first of all, from a fiscal perspective, it required ultimately funding that I had to ultimately put into the business. That we as our family made a decision. We wanted to make sure that we were going to be financially stable. The business was going to be financially stable. So in that respect, I didn't have to necessarily sacrifice some of our hallmarks in terms of cutting corners with certain types of inventory that we carried. But it's so important. I talk about our team constantly.
Yes.
And we kept substantially all of our team on board. And I thought that was critical in making sure that when this finally ended, it was going to be as seamless as possible. And we're seeing the net benefit from that now. You know, Pepsi just returned to their building, and earlier this week, someone had come in for lunch, and they saw one of the servers that would serve them all the time when they were in here 18 months ago, and they, you know, obviously hugged him and gave him a big hello, and it's great to see him. There's something to that, right? This is a person who comes to work every day. They drive past our establishment. For years, they spend so much time here, and when they come back in, they're not seeing a whole round of new faces. It's still the same people. So I like to think that the message that we portray in that is, again, consistency. I'm always going to go there. I'm going to know a face in there. They're going to know who I am. They're going to put out the same product that they always did, hopefully, right? It's going to be delightful. We're going to have a good time. And that's what we tried to do during that period of time, is to try and reinforce that this will end at some point, and it is ending, despite, you know, whatever the politics are. It's going to end at some point, and businesses are thriving now. You're starting to see every day the forecast for 2022. Things are going to get better, and I knew that as long as we kept to our core values,
Right.
there would be a net benefit at the end.
And I found it very interesting, maybe this little, so we don't.
Yes.
Sorry for the tech
It happens.
issues today. This is not our best day for tech, but we're
Getting through it.
adapting. We're adapting. And I just sort of lost my. Oh yes, I remember that you had pointed out to me that by another benefit of having kept all your key staff members was this kind of a more relaxed feeling that they had. I mean, they were holding on to their jobs and they could still feed their families, and they knew that was secure. And also that
Yeah, again, it's although we never want to go back to that period of time, there is just thinking about it, there is somewhat of a sense of good memories in terms of seeing our team on a Friday evening packing out the literally hundreds of bags of food that were being delivered, and the stories that they would tell me of customers what they would speak to on the phone saying, JC answered the phone and I'm so glad that you're there, and it was, I think people genuinely respected the fact that we made sure that our team was there. And how many people have told me that I went to so-and-so's door for delivery, they were so happy that we were delivering, and more important that I was delivering it to them.
Yes.
There were so many of those stories, and thinking back to that, it makes me feel good, because I remember when they were telling me that at the time, you want to hope that, again, everything will get back to normal at one time. And I was actually surprised when we first reopened and were allowed to have seating inside. The number of customers that inquired to our team members, asking them how they were treated during COVID. It was actually quite surprising to me, because I would eventually go over to a table and they said, and I spoke to Luis and he told me that you kept everybody on and you did this, and I just never thought that I would ever engage in that type of colloquy with a person when I was out to dinner, but it happened on so many different occasions. And I guess there is a sense of wanting to make sure local businesses are doing the right things, not only for the business and the community, but to make sure that they're taking care of the people that are employed by them.
Exactly.
So that's actually a wonderful credit to our community that they wanted to know that.
Yes, I agree. Clearly, for most of the pandemic, sorry.
It's okay.
Once again.
Yep.
You worried, of course, that your business was in jeopardy. You were understandably overwhelmed with uncertainty and fear. Somehow, gradually, slowly, teeny bit by teeny bit, there started to be a shift, a bit of an evolution, if you will, in your thinking. What were the factors that fueled that shift?
I believe it was probably late spring of 2020. I started to see our numbers were increasing each week, and the number of deliveries we were doing were increasing each week. So I knew that our delivery side was going to continue to do well. What concerns me was, obviously we knew the cold weather was going to happen, so we got through all that part. Our deliveries were consistently now a lot every evening, but where I really saw the best numbers was May of 2021. We were only off by a small margin.
That's
and
incredible.
that to me, compared to that, because I look at, whenever I do comparisons, it's today, just before we sat down, I did a comparison year to date of 2019, and we're like running dead even, which is phenomenal.
That's amazing.
Right, and I looked at the numbers in spring of 21. I started to see where we were headed, and we were only off by about 14% from May of 19. I'm sorry if I'm a little off on my dates. But May of 21 to May of 19, we were only off by about 14%. Some people sit there and say, what could you find so appealing about that? My answer was, when I looked at the mitigating factors, I said, there's no school in session in May of 21. There was no colleges here, so we had none of our graduation parties. There was still no really people celebrating religious milestones like communions and confirmations. And we were still only off by 14%. So I said, and there was no corporate in the area.
Right.
So when I extracted out those different communities that normally would be here supporting us, I realized we're going to be right back to where we need to be. And quite honestly, once the summer began and most of the restrictions were lifted, it's just been, as if, this never happened. And I think what happened is we grew our takeout and delivery business so dramatically during that period of time that it's become, a real monster for us from a business side. And I think that's only going to bode well for us as we go into 2022, I believe.
Well, I remember your projecting that, coming into this past spring, everything from the release of pent-up demand to the local corporations bringing back at least a certain percentage of their employees. I believe PepsiCo was supposed to do that in June. It may not have happened, but that was, that was an exciting, promising type of.
It was something to look forward to. It really was when we were able to start to see the restrictions really being lifted and the vaccines being administered and the cases going down to at one point where it was really, really low. I think it was less than 1%. You just saw the shift and that pent-up demand, racing in, and we started to contemplate where this was going to take us. And so May, most of the restrictions, mid-May were lifted, and in June we took off, particularly well. And remember what happened. Not only had we built up our takeout and delivery business dramatically, but we had also the previous year built out a back patio.
Right.
That picked us up another, I think, 8 tables, which is about another 32 seats. So by adapting the way we did and building that back patio, we ultimately increased the size of our dining room by another 32 seats. So all of these different things that we did are now paying dividends now. But when we did them initially back in 2020, we could not have sat there and thought this was going to be the positive impact that we were going to enjoy in 2021. But that's when we really started to see we knew our deliveries were going to be steady, we knew our takeout was going to be steady, but really when the vaccines started to come into place and the restrictions were lifted in mid-May, we saw the turn of events.
Now, here's something I found very interesting, that there were a good number of restaurateurs who, in the midst of all of this, felt it was a great time to open another restaurant because landlords were desperate for rent. They were decreasing rents dramatically, and the feeling was, let's jump on this opportunity. Now, you are always very skeptical of that kind of decision. Can you explain what your thinking was and how it differed?
Till this day, I see a lot of guys just deciding that they're going to open up, and it's because the landlords are extending terms that are essentially lottery tickets for people going into business. I've heard stories where certain restaurants have opened where a landlord, offered them 12 months free rent, and when you're doing your projections, you're sitting there saying, "Wow, I'm not going to have to pay rent for 12 months." But there always comes a time where you got to pay a bill, and that time will come. And I think that what's happening is that they are going into these businesses with not a real good understanding of what is necessary to move forward. And I think that's they're basing it on a false assumption is what I would probably say. It's a false assumption of what they believe their numbers are going to be, and I just don't think it's going to bode well for them in the long run. But who am I to say? I don't know.
Well, you also in our conversations emphasized what to me are business fundamentals. What is your strategic plan?
Right.
What is your game plan? Have you done your homework?
Right.
Have you done your research? What's your competitive advantage?
Right. I mean, one of the biggest things in the restaurant industry is occupancy costs. And so when you go into an area and you have a projection of what you believe that your business is going to generate based on traffic counts and number of houses and the like, how is a person putting together a business plan in the middle of COVID? What are you projecting it on? Are you projecting it on something that you believe is just a hunch? Because that's not a very good business plan. And are you proposing a business plan that's based upon not paying rent for a year? And if that's what your parachute is, again, there's going to come a time where those numbers are going to come into play. So a successful restaurant wants to have their occupancy costs somewhere between 5 and 7% of their gross revenue. Mm-hmm. Well, what is your occupancy cost? What's your revenue going to be? What are you projecting your revenue to be when you really, how can anyone predict what it's going to be? You don't know. You don't know what it's going to be in this particular environment because it's too nebulous to try and figure out. Mm-hmm. So I see guys opening up and I see landlords giving out sweetheart deals, and I just pray for them. I pray that that this was not. I've heard at least 2 or 3 stories of servers who were given opportunities to go into, not my servers but other servers in other restaurants, and they've opened up places and they're going to take a shot. I don't think I would want to go into business to take a shot. I would want to make sure if I'm going to take a shot, it's going to be a strategic shot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that your bar was packed throughout the pandemic. I mean, of course, the periods of time when you were,
correct,
of course, permitted. To operate that bar. Yeah.
Yep.
What does that mean to you? Because it's interesting the kind of divide there seems to be in terms of those who are comfortable with indoor dining and those who are not. But if you came and looked at Anthony's bar, you'd think it was, the roaring 20s.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because I had this conversation literally earlier today. Remember, we're dealing with a novel virus that no one really has any crystal ball as to what's right and what's wrong and when it's going to end. And there's people that are just very fearful, and rightfully so. They've probably lost family members or know someone that succumbed to the virus. And there's a divide in our country on this illness. And there are certain people that, you don't want to tag anyone that comes and sits at a bar and say, well, that person obviously adheres to that side of the argument. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is a comfort level of people who were coming in and sitting at the bar that had come to grips with they believed were the risks of the virus, and whether or not going into a restaurant was going to be a risk of spread to them. And I think that to that argument, I do think that restaurants were unfairly labeled throughout the pandemic that you know, if you go into,
Super
you go into a restaurant and you're going to get COVID. It's the craziest thing. Then you would go into, you know, Home Depot and the place would be completely packed, or you'd go into the supermarket and be completely packed. And why they were labeled that way, restaurants are still paying for that message, unfortunately. I read constantly, you know, from the, you know, stories from the National Restaurant Association, and they do national polling, and there is still an unfortunate stigma that restaurants are dealing with, that they are incubators for the spread of COVID, and it's very unfair. I think it's an unfair stigma.
Well, I think something that was unexpected that occurred, especially after a pandemic-induced recession and almost depression-level unemployment for so long, and all of a sudden, everyone's talking about a labor shortage. And I understand you yourself
Yes.
was
Still are.
confronted and still are. So can you share with us your thinking about the various causes? Because of course everything works together. It's not just one thing. And what you've had to do as a result.
Well, first, it's not just the restaurant industry that's been adversely affected by the labor shortage. There are a lot of different industries that have been adversely affected. Looking at it just from where it hits home the most, though, is my place in terms of what we've dealt with. And so we had issues, particularly with labor, and it was unanticipated. And when I say unanticipated, there had been so many people, so many restaurants that had closed down during the pandemic, or so many restaurants that had let go so many workers, that I honestly thought we would have the pick of the litter when it came time to increase hiring. And so you ask, why do I think that played into it, is having had conversations now with potential and prospective employees that came through, it was directly related to the amount of unemployment that they were receiving. And, you know, for whatever reason, some people maybe say that they didn't feel safe coming back to work. You know, I have my healthy dose of skepticism related to that, because these are the same people that, you know, go out to dinner and they're out shopping all the time. So I don't know if it was really related to their safety issue. I just think that the programs were at first designed to be helpful, and I think that they did in fact provide many people with the necessary financial bridge that they needed to survive. But then there came a point where the economies had opened, and by continuing the programs, it was not giving people a real impetus to go back to work. And you see it in the resumes that we receive now. You see that it's not that a person works, they were working and they just left their own job and they're coming back to me now. I had somebody that said they hadn't worked in a year and a half. And excuse me. And when I hear that, I say, you know, you're a young man, you're healthy, why? Because there's plenty of jobs. And so you start to wonder. You start to wonder what the person's work ethic is. And I think that's an unfortunate reality that we're facing in this industry right now. So real hard time finding labor, even though most of the unemployment has run out, still having a hard time finding people. And what happens as a result of that is the cost of labor goes up. So now you have guys coming in and they know that there's a labor shortage. And it's like any other business, supply and demand. There's not enough houses on the market, so the value of the homes is going up. You know, employees are the same thing. They know that there's a labor shortage. They know they got the pick of the litter. They know that this industry is struggling. So when they come in, maybe they knew that particular type of position only paid X number of dollars. Now they're coming in and saying, yeah, I'll come on board, but I want X plus.
Right.
And there's only so many ways to pass that on to the consumer before it becomes prohibitive and potentially obnoxious. You can't do it, right? There's only so much that we can do, so it's unfortunate.
Now, I thought a statistic, so to speak, that you had shared with me back when you needed to, I don't know if this was the first round of hiring that you had to do. I'm forgetting the exact timing on it, but could you tell us about how you proceeded as you normally would in terms of posting the ads and
it happens still today.
The response that you usually would get and in how much time you would get it versus what actually happened? To me, that was a perfect encapsulation.
So it's still happening. So we tend to, when we go out and we're looking to hire for a position, we post on Indeed and we post on Craigslist. Word of mouth, obviously, it's always great to have somebody bring somebody in. But it used to be that if I posted an ad on Indeed and in Craigslist, within 5 minutes of posting the ad, I would immediately get resumes. And by the time I would wake up the next morning, my inbox would be filled with just tons and tons and tons of potential candidates to the point where we would want to shut it off because we didn't want to take in any more resumes. We had enough people that we were going to be interviewing, and we just basically would close down the job opportunity. So again, you heard that there was a labor shortage, but not really believing it's ever going to happen to you. I put the ad up, and I had to actually go back to my Indeed account to make sure that I'd actually posted it. I said, maybe I didn't post it correctly. We didn't receive a single resume. Not a single resume was received, and it was a complete turnaround from what we normally were accustomed to receiving. And so most recently we just posted again, and again there's just no resumes. There's nobody there that's looking to work, and it's shocking to me the lack of response. It's just strange, because you know that if you look at the unemployment numbers, there's so many people on unemployment, and you're posting these jobs, and it's not just me that's posting them. It's everybody that's posting them, and it's just a phenomenon that I don't think anyone anticipated when this happened. There were so many things that happened during this pandemic that nobody could have anticipated.
Right.
The supply chain issues, and you know, we're having problems bringing product in from Italy in terms of the different wines that we use. I had a conversation with someone today, and they said that they're probably still 6 weeks out, and that's as a result of ports being closed. And these are things that prior to March of 2020, you just never thought of these issues. You just never thought of them, and so again, like any other small business owner, you have to learn how to adapt to the circumstances and make sure you keep your business relevant and keeping your customers happy.
It's interesting because we, at various different times during this Videocast series, have noted the difficulty inherent in being in this restaurant business. Not only for a restaurant, for an owner, but really for every member
large contingency of past hospitality workers who realized that the hours were daunting, that it was not a great lifestyle for them, and they've made changes, and they've made changes in their lifestyle, and they wanted to try something new.
Right.
I can't imagine that's the predominant reason why people aren't coming back to work, but I believe that there is a large contingency of former hospitality workers who have decided to take a change of pace. And eventually they may come back to it, but they looked at it and said, no, there's other opportunities out there, and I'm going to venture off and see what they are. And I certainly commend anybody that wants to go out and change. You know, I've had employees that have left here to go start a welding business, or yeah. So you always want to see people want to take change. I don't think this is a business anybody should be married to. I think that it does have an adverse effect on things like family life and social aspects because of the nature of the business and the hours that you keep. It's not a great way to harbor healthy relationships, so to speak.
Do you think that whether it's you individually or maybe in concert with colleagues in the business may attempt to conceptualize a different kind of business model for this industry? Now that the difficult aspects of it seem to be, you know, right out in the open and in front of us, and people are kind of acting on that now. Is there another way to do it, basically?
Well, I hope there is. I like to find it. I think that part of the problem with having that ingenuity at this particular moment is that a lot of people are playing catch up, right? They've been down for so long, they just want to get back to some sense of normalcy with their business. They want to get back to some fiscal normalcy. So it's difficult to sit there and create that time. I did speak to a restaurant owner who had closed his restaurant after 21 years in Manhattan, and he said, I'm just taking this time now to figure out my next move. It's going to be involved in food, he said, but it's going to be different. It's going to be more of a takeout concept. It's going to be more, and I think that probably the pop-up restaurants that you're seeing happen, and I think you're going to see more of that going forward, only because I think people have learned that they don't want to be married to a long-term lease. If maybe they only want to do a seasonal pop-up restaurant and then spend the rest of the year doing something else. I certainly am involved in many other ventures, and for my own well-being, I need to do it. Otherwise, you start to get yourself too pigeonholed into one business, and this is not something that you want to in as much as I'm responsible here, and we want to make sure it runs perfectly. It is a very demanding business on your health, your hours, your lack of being able to enjoy your weekends. There is no weekends here. So you know, you want to look at other opportunities. So maybe those pop-up restaurants are in fact the way to go in the future, where you're not married to a long-term commitment and you're able to do it and maybe change your concept as you do them.
So it'll be interesting to see, I think, moving forward.
I do too.
How